They called it invincible until a single crash on a frozen shore quietly began to undo that reputation. This is the story of how one pilot's last, unintended landing on a remote Aleutian spit would, in time, become a kind of military legend. Not because he fought to the last round, but because what remained of his aircraft taught an enemy how to fight back. What follows treats the core events as documented. It also traces how a wartime narrative grew around them. A few names and minor details remain indefinido, pending archival confirmation. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, the Mitsubishi A6M was the terror of the Pacific. To the men who flew against it, the Zero felt less like a plane and more like a force. Astonishingly nimble, blessed with range that let it appear over distant decks and islands, and able to outturn almost anything the Allies could field. Its design embodied a philosophy: lightweight structure, minimal armor, and fuel systems optimized for range and maneuverability. Those choices produced a machine that dominated dogfights. But they were compromises, trade-offs that made the Zero superb at certain tasks and vulnerable in others. Across the Pacific, the effect was immediate. Pilots who had trained to meet more balanced fighters found themselves outturned and outmaneuvered. Early engagements revealed a pattern. The Zero could get into a position and stay there. Allied pilots discovered the hard way that energy, tactics, speed, and diving attacks were harder to exploit against a plane that could stay in the turning game. For a time, that combination of characteristics, superb handling, little protection, long legs, gave the Japanese Navy air superiority wherever the Zero operated. It was into that atmosphere of awe that a small, almost accidental incident would insert itself and begin to change everything. In early June 1942, during a raid connected to operations in the Aleutians and the broader Pacific campaign, a Mitsubishi A6M suffered damage or mechanical trouble and was forced down on the barren shoreline of Okatan Island. The pilot Tadayoshi Koga did not survive the forced belly landing. His death, by many accounts, was not the dramatic last stand that war stories prefer. Reports indicate the aircraft made a rough, unintended touchdown, and the pilot was mortally wounded in the crash. Those immediate facts are straightforward. The rest is the story of what happened next, and how meaning accreted to that moment. A U.S. Navy PBY Catalina, on routine patrol, spotted the wreck when a rare break in the Aleutian fog revealed the pale silhouette against dark tundra. Lieutenant William T. Tazrick recorded in contemporaneous reports as the pilot who first reported the sighting sent the message that would start a secret and risky recovery operation. The Aleutians were unforgiving: sudden storms, freezing winds, and a landscape that swallowed radios and radio's confidence alike. Yet the wreck lay intact enough that the airplane's condition suggested it might be salvageably intact. A 6M in American hands would be more than curiosity. It would be a technical treasure. Command moved quickly. Within naval channels, sensitivities about morale and intelligence intersected. An intact enemy fighter could yield answers to questions that dogfights couldn't. Recovery teams mounted attempts, despite perilous surf and weather, making repeated efforts to access the island and lift the wreck. The initial attempts faltered against the elements. A later, daring landing and removal succeeded. The airplane was shipped under strict secrecy to the continental United States and ultimately to the Fleet Air Base at North Island, San Diego, where Navy and industry experts began the slow, meticulous work of turning an enemy machine into usable knowledge. What the investigators encountered surprised no one in principle, but shocked many in detail. The Zero in front of them was at once elegant and raw. It was a lightweight fighter that had won, in part, because it did not try to be a tank. Its strengths were obvious on inspection: a large wing area that delivered outstanding lift at low speeds, clean aerodynamics that rewarded careful handling, and a configuration that pushed the pilot's skill to the fore. Beneath the skin, however, were the vulnerabilities that years of Allied losses had hinted at but not yet measured. Engineers and test pilots, Navy technicians at North Island, and a team of industry mechanics and aerodynamicists began systematic teardown, repair, and flight testing. The plane was carefully restored to flight-worthy condition, and then evaluated under controlled conditions. The tests were designed to discover not just top speed and climb, but the behaviors that matter in combat. How the controls responded at high speed, what happened when the pilot pulled or pushed aggressively, and how the plane reacted when exposed to damage. Those experiments yielded several decisive findings. First, the Zero's light construction meant it had almost no armor for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks. Where American fighters increasingly incorporated armor and tanks that would seal after hits. The Zero's choices amplified both pilot exposure and the risk of fires. Second, and perhaps most tactically useful, investigators discovered the plane's engine and fuel systems could be disrupted by certain maneuvers. Specifically, a tendency for the carburetor to cut out during negative G maneuvers. In practical terms, that meant a maneuver that forced the Zero to push over rapidly diving, or being forced into negative G situations could momentarily stop its engine, or at least rob it of power. Third, at higher speeds, the controlled surfaces did not behave as benignly as in slow-speed dogfight conditions. The pilot would find controls stiffening, and the plane could become less responsive when pushed into maneuvers outside its comfortable envelope. Those technical particulars mattered because they turned a myth into a tactical lever. The Zero had been winning by exploiting turning engagements and low-speed maneuvering. The capture and testing revealed that if Allied pilots could avoid getting sucked into the slow-turning fight and instead engaged with speed, dives and hit-and-run tactics, if they could dictate the energy state of the fight, they could blunt the Zero's advantages and exploit its fragility. The immediate translation of those lessons was not a single instruction manual, but a cascade of changes in tactics, training, and aircraft design. Squadron leaders and tactical thinkers in the Pacific did not invent new ideas out of nothing there. Adaptations were already underway, but the hard data from the captured Zero accelerated the adoption of energy tactics. Pilots were coached to use boom and zoom, diving in from altitude to make high-speed slashing attacks, then climbing away before the enemy could bring its strengths to bear. The Thatch-Weaver defensive team maneuver developed earlier by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, name spelling indefinido for confirmation, also found renewed relevance as flight leaders combined mutual support with energy tactics to blunt the Zero's turn fighting. Beyond doctrine, the captured aircraft influenced design and procurement decisions. Grumman's F-6F Hellcat, already in development, benefited from clearer performance targets once engineers and test pilots could compare American and Japanese characteristics directly. The Hellcat emphasized robust construction, heavier armament, and a design philosophy that accepted weight in order to gain protection and durability, an answer of sorts to the Zero's earlier advantages. Test pilots, who flew the captured Zero and then climbed into American fighters, could feel the contrasts directly. Where the Zero was forgiving at low speed, the Hellcat was built to withstand the brutalities of prolonged combat and return its pilot home. Those changes were not instantaneous miracles. Air campaigns are complex mosaics where training, logistics, aircraft production, leadership, and chance all combine. The captured Zero did not single-handedly tip the Pacific. It was, however, a pivotal tile in a mosaic whose shifting pieces increasingly favored Allied air forces by 1943 and into 1944. By supplying concrete, actionable knowledge about enemy strengths and, crucially, weaknesses, the Aleutian find accelerated learning and helped save lives over the subsequent campaigns. It is here, between the plane's technical findings and the human stories that followed, that the notion of a final stand began to form. Wartime storytelling needed heroes and symbols, and a damaged fighter on a lonely shore lent itself to a certain narrative architecture, a solitary figure, a machine, a remote burial. Over time, the pilot's last moments, most evidence indicates a forced, fatal emergency landing, were reframed in some accounts as a deliberate stand, as if the pilot had stretched his final breath into a deliberate defiance. That interpretation is powerful and evocative, but it is interpretation. The historical record supports the essential facts of crash, recovery, and testing. On the question of intentional heroics, the evidence is indefinido, and where it is absent, it is important to distinguish fact from the legend that grew around it. The captured Zero's life in American hands had one more ironical twist. After months of tests and demonstration flights that taught so much, the aircraft itself was lost not in Pacific combat, but in an accident on American soil. The plane that had helped tilt the balance was destroyed in a peacetime mishap during training operations in the United States. That ghastly little irony, how fragile the symbols of power can be, became a fitting coda. A machine that had once seemed invincible met a mundane end, far from the fierce ocean where its reputation was forged. What, then, is the legacy of that single crash and the plane it left behind? First, it is a cautionary lesson about the texture of historical causality. Wars are not decided by one moment or one item. They are the product of systems of adaptation. Yet within those systems, small events can have outsized consequences when they supply missing information at a crucial time. The Aleutian recovery provided precisely that missing information. Empirical tests that transformed assumptions into usable knowledge and turned fear into tactics. Second, it is a human lesson about how we make meaning. Soldiers, pilots, and civilians all search for stories that help them interpret chaos. A lone pilot's death in an empty place became for some evidence of stoic heroism. For others, it was a technical windfall. Both readings are part of the truth. Honoring the life lost does not require turning it into legendary martyrdom. We can respect the individual while still recognizing the prosaic mechanics by which machines and knowledge guided later success. Finally, there is an ethical dimension to wartime intelligence illustrated by this case. The recovery of the aircraft was conducted under secrecy, with respect for the fallen formalized into handling procedures. The goal was not to gloat over a corpse, but to prevent more deaths by learning how to fight better and, if possible, fight more humanely. Turning enemy technology into defensive advantage is an old practice of war. But this instance highlights the heavy practical calculus that sits behind grand narratives. Engineers poring over rivets, pilots testing stalls, instructors rewriting training salabile, the less dramatic but no less decisive elements of conflict. If there is a single sentence that captures the paradox, it might be this: a pilot who did not die in a dramatic last stand, nevertheless, through the misfortune of his aircraft and the opportunity of its recovery, helped alter the course of aerial combat. The legend one soldier's final stand that became military legend forever grew because people needed a symbol, because stories simplify, and because the true causal chain crash, capture, testing, doctrinal change, improved aircraft, altered combat outcomes contains within it both the tragic personal loss and the hard technical work that followed. Before we close, if this kind of turning point story interests you, subscribe for more episodes that examine how small events shaped much larger outcomes. There are, of course, unresolved details that deserve archival confirmation. Exact spellings and certain attributions in some contemporary reports remain indefinite. Historians and archivists continue to refine the record. But the broad outline stands firm. An emergency landing on a frozen spit produced an intact enemy fighter. American hands and minds turned that machine into knowledge. That knowledge helped reshape tactics and design. And, in the end, the captured plane met an ordinary, melancholic end, far from the ocean where its legend began. History does not always unfold on grand stages. Sometimes it quietly pivots on a single, unexpected salvage, on technicians in hangars, on pilots who fly test loops to learn an enemy's habits. The Aleutian find is a reminder that wars are fought as much in workshops and briefing rooms as in the air. Remembering the pilot and naming the sequence of events does not cheapen sacrifice. It enlarges our understanding of how human lives and mechanical limits together change the course of conflict. Which small, seemingly accidental event would you call a turning point? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe to follow more stories of the accidents, choices, and discoveries that reshaped history.